Three engineers sat in a room in Beijing. They watched a signal disappear. And they said nothing to the world for 11 hours. What happened during those 11 hours, what China's spacecraft saw, what it confirmed, and why the silence that followed may be the most consequential act in the modern space age. That is what this is about. Right now, on the far side of the moon, a Chinese rover is moving. It has been moving since January 3rd, 2019. And in all that time, the data it has collected, the full, unredacted scientific record, has never been shared with the international community in any meaningful way. Think about what that means. The far side of the moon is the most scientifically valuable piece of real estate accessible to humanity outside Earth's atmosphere. It has been visited exactly once by any nation. And the nation that got there first decided, deliberately, quietly, to keep what it found largely to itself. But to understand why that silence is so profound, we first have to understand what the far side actually is. Because most people, including most educated people, have a fundamental misunderstanding of what they are talking about. The moon does not spin relative to Earth. It is tidally locked, rotating on its own axis at precisely the same rate it orbits us, which means the same hemisphere has faced Earth for over 4 billion years. The near side, the face of every painting, every mythology, every photograph taken since the invention of the camera, is the only side humanity had ever seen up close until 2019. The far side is not the dark side. That is a myth. It receives sunlight. What it does not receive is Earth. There is no line of sight communication with Earth from the far side of the moon. No radio signal penetrates the lunar body. No telemetry, no voice, no data. This is not a limitation of technology. It is a law of physics written into the geometry of the solar system. If you land on the far side, you are cut off. Completely. Permanently. Until you build a way around it. And that is precisely what made the far side simultaneously so desirable and so technically daunting. The near side of the moon is electromagnetically noisy, bombarded by radio interference from Earth's civilization. The far side is the most radio-quiet environment within reach of any spacecraft humanity has ever built. For radio astronomers, it is the equivalent of a mountaintop observatory above every cloud that has ever formed. But there is something else about the far side that most reporting almost never mentions. Something geological. Something that upends a foundational assumption about how the moon and by extension, the early solar system formed. The far side has a different texture. Literally. The near side is covered in dark volcanic plains called mare. The far side is almost entirely ancient highland terrain, cratered, primitive, untouched. The two hemispheres of the same body are so different in character that they look like they came from different worlds. Why? No one fully agreed. Until Chang'e 4 landed. To appreciate what China achieved, you need to stand in 1959 for a moment. On October 7th of that year, the Soviet probe Lunar 3 rounded the moon and took the first photographs ever captured of the far side. They were blurry. They were partial. They were enough to shock the scientific world. The Soviets saw a surface that bore almost no resemblance to what humanity had always seen when looking up. Where the near side had wide, smooth volcanic seas, the far side had almost none. Just craters, and more craters, layered over billions of years. The Soviet scientists who developed those photographs in a Moscow laboratory reportedly went quiet. Not because they were trained to be secretive, they were, of course, operating in a Cold War intelligence environment, but because what they saw was genuinely, deeply strange. A geologist named Alexander Bazalevsky, who spent decades studying those images, later described the experience as being handed a portrait of someone you thought you knew intimately, only to discover the other side of their face was unrecognizable. That image, that dissonance, haunted planetary science for 6 decades. Every subsequent mission confirmed the asymmetry, but could not explain it. The Apollo astronauts flew over the far side during their transit orbits. Harrison Schmitt, the only geologist to walk on the moon, described the far side as visible through the command module windows during Apollo 17 as looking at a completely different world. He could see the difference in texture, in reflectivity, even from orbit. But seeing is not landing. And for 60 years, no spacecraft had ever successfully soft-landed on that surface, because the communication problem had no solution that any space agency had been willing to invest in solving. Until China decided it was worth it. The solution China engineered is, on its surface, elegantly simple. But the execution was something else entirely. If you cannot communicate directly from the moon's far side to Earth, You place a relay satellite in a position where it can see both simultaneously. That position exists. It is called the Earth-Moon Lagrange Point 2, a gravitational equilibrium zone about 65,000 kilometers beyond the Moon. An object placed there in a halo orbit stays there with minimal fuel expenditure, maintaining a permanent line of sight to both the lunar far side and Earth. China launched that relay satellite named Queqiao, the Magpie Bridge, after a Chinese legend about lovers separated by a celestial river, in May 2018. 7 months later, they launched the lander and rover. On January 3, 2019, at 02:26 Beijing time, Chang'e 4 touched down in the von Karman crater. The von Karman crater sits inside the South Pole Aitken Basin, the largest confirmed impact crater in the entire solar system, 2,500 kilometers across, 13 kilometers deep. A wound in the Moon's crust so ancient and so violent that it may have excavated material from the lunar mantle itself, from below the crust, from depths no instrument had ever directly sampled. When the signal came through Queqiao and reached the Beijing Aerospace Control Center, the flight controllers reportedly stood up from their consoles, not because the protocol required it, because they could not stay seated. But here is what almost no one reported at the time, and what still has not received the attention it deserves. The moment Chang'e 4 landed, it was sitting on geological material that predates the formation of Earth's oceans. The von Karman crater floor is estimated to be between 3, 6 and 4 billion years old. Every measurement the rover's instruments take is reaching back through time to a period when the solar system was still deciding what it was going to become. And the rover's instruments detected something in the first weeks of surface operations that sent a quiet ripple through the planetary science community worldwide. Here is where the story becomes something stranger than a technical achievement. China released initial images from Chang'e 4 within hours of landing. The images were extraordinary, a grey-brown panorama of an ancient, heavily cratered basin floor, utterly alien, and yet somehow familiar, like the surface of a place you have visited in a dream. The global scientific community responded with genuine excitement. Papers were published. Press conferences were held. Wu Weiren, the chief designer of China's lunar exploration program, described the landing as a moment that, in his words, opened a new chapter. And for once, the hyperbole felt earned. But then something shifted. Not immediately. Gradually. The raw data, the spectrometer readings, the ground-penetrating radar profiles, the precise subsurface layering data from the lunar-penetrating radar instrument aboard the U-22 rover began to trickle out in highly curated forms. Papers appeared in Chinese journals first, sometimes months before any international peer review. Certain datasets were referenced but not released. Requests from international researchers for access to raw data were met with responses that were polite and delayed and ultimately inconclusive. A researcher at a European planetary science institution, who asked not to be named in order to protect collaborative relationships, described the experience to a science journalist in 2021 as receiving a summary of a book he wanted to read. The summary was interesting. The book remained locked. This matters for a reason that has nothing to do with politics and everything to do with science. When NASA's Apollo missions returned lunar samples to Earth, those samples were distributed not just to American scientists, but to researchers in the Soviet Union, in Europe, in Japan. When the Soviet lunar program returned automated samples in the 1970s, some were eventually made available for study. The tradition of lunar science has been, imperfectly but genuinely, international. The knowledge belonged, in some sense, to everyone. The Chang'e 4 mission did not follow that tradition, and the scientists who work in this field know it. Most of them will not say it publicly, because China is a major player in international collaboration on other missions, and burning that relationship has real professional costs. But in private, at conferences, over dinners in cities like Houston and Vienna and Tokyo, it comes up. A certain frustration, a certain unease. One American planetary geologist speaking at a workshop in 2022 put it this way, not as an accusation, but as a genuine scientific lament. We sent humans to the moon and gave the rocks to the world. They sent a robot, and they kept the data. I am not sure history will remember that kindly. In 2020, a paper appeared in the journal Science Advances. It was authored by a Chinese-led research team and announced a finding that, in any other context, would have led every science news outlet on Earth for a week. The U-22 rover's visible and near-infrared spectrometer had detected what appeared to be olivine and pyroxene in the von Karman crater floor. Minerals that, if confirmed, and in the quantity suggested, would indicate the crater had indeed excavated material from the lunar mantle. This was not a minor geological footnote. This was, potentially, the first direct observation of the moon's interior chemistry from the surface. To understand what that means, consider what the mantle is. Every world with a differentiated interior, Earth, Mars, Mercury, the Moon, has a crust floating on top of a deeper layer of denser, hotter material. We have never directly touched Earth's mantle. We have never touched Mars's mantle. We have one set of samples from the Moon's surface, and they are all crustal. The mantle of every world in our solar system has remained beyond reach. And here was data suggesting that an ancient impact had done the excavation for us, that the floor of Von Kiome crater was paved with the Moon's interior, exposed to the sky, waiting to be analyzed. But the confirmation of that finding, the follow-up analysis, the expanded spectral data, the ground truth that would transform a detection into a discovery, remained tied up in a data release process that moved on no one's timeline but China's. The international planetary science community could read the papers. They could not independently verify the raw data. They could not run their own calibration algorithms on the spectrometer readings. They could not challenge or confirm the interpretation with the rigor that extraordinary claims require. There is something almost melancholy about this. Here is a genuine scientific achievement, a moment that could stand alongside the first photographs of the lunar far side, alongside the Apollo landings, alongside Voyager's exit from the solar system in the annals of human exploration. And it is shadowed, not by failure, not by tragedy, but by a choice. A deliberate, sovereign, entirely legal choice to treat the data from the most scientifically significant landing in a generation as a strategic asset rather than a common inheritance. The instruments work. The rover is still operational. As of recent reports, U-22 has traveled farther across the lunar surface than any rover in history on the Moon. It is finding things. We are receiving curated summaries of what those things are. The far side of the Moon kept its secrets for 4 billion years. It seems it is still keeping some of them. Here is the reframe that matters. What China did in landing on the far side of the Moon was not just a technological achievement. It was a statement about the future architecture of space exploration. Who gets to go? Who gets to know? And who sets the rules? The 20th century model of space, where two superpowers raced each other to milestones while inadvertently creating a body of shared knowledge, is over. What replaces it is still being negotiated. The Artemis program is returning humans to the Moon. China's own crewed lunar program has targets in the mid-2030s. Both nations have expressed interest in the South Pole, in the permanently shadowed craters that may contain water ice, fuel for every mission that comes after. Both nations have looked at the Von Kiome Basin. Both nations understand what is there. And neither nation is currently talking to the other about what happens when they both show up. The far side was the opening move in a game whose rules have not been written yet. The next move, the one that will determine whether the Moon becomes a shared scientific resource or a contested frontier, is already in motion. If you want to understand what the Moon's South Pole actually contains, why the permanently shadowed craters there may be the most strategically important locations in the solar system, and why 3 nations are preparing to stake claims to a resource no international law currently governs, that is next.